Today I'm giving you my top 3 49er destroyers. These are the players that own the 49ers. 49ers killers in my lifetime as a fan. They have prevented the 49ers from winning the big games, playoff games, even getting to the Super Bowl. They have stood in their way, and they have been a problem. Now I'm giving you 3, and the third one is, he's a problem, all right, but not nearly on the level as number 2 and number 1 in my top 3, and it's Bobby Wagner, who has been, until last year, the quarterback of the Seattle Seahawks defense. And I think it's fair to say about Bobby Wagner that he has taken advantage of some average to terrible quarterback play in San Francisco. Let's put Colin Kaepernick aside and what he was able to do in 12 and 13 and even in 14, and let's consider how bad the 49ers quarterback position has been when Kaepernick's days ended with the 49ers up to Jimmy Garoppolo, and Jimmy Garoppolo is nothing more than an average quarterback. Let's see how he does in Las Vegas without all of these weapons he has around him. And that's a whole nother discussion about Brock Purdy or Trey Lance. How good are these quarterbacks? I mean, these are the best weapons in the NFL, and that's where you have to be critical of Garoppolo. But let's get back to Bobby Wagner, because we could talk about Jimmy Garoppolo all day long. But I respect Bobby Wagner because things changed in 2012. In that 2012 draft, that's when the Seahawks became the team that we knew them to be, and they became a real competitor, and they became a thorn in the 49ers side. It wasn't just players owning the 49ers, it was a team. And Pete Carroll put his team together in 2012, obviously bring in Russell Wilson, and then on the defense, Bobby Wagner. Bobby Wagner is and has been one of the most durable linebackers in the NFL. He stays healthy. It's not only a matter of staying healthy, and that's hard to do at middle linebacker, but to have the impact and to be a complete all-around middle linebacker is an accomplishment when it's all about edge play. It's all about getting to the quarterback, but he's been valuable in more ways than that, obviously. A tackling machine, sideline to sideline linebacker, plays coverage, can go deep into coverage. And when needed, he can sack the quarterback, even though that is not usually his game or his specialty. But he's sacked 49er quarterbacks plenty of times. You can't point to necessarily one crushing play that Bobby Wagner's made. I do remember the pick 6 he had off Nick Mullins. That's one I can remember. You can point to that 2012, and the Seahawks, after their run, when they had a stacked and loaded defense, you think about the Legion of Boom. He was the best player throughout those seasons, those 10 seasons he was in Seattle. Over that period, he was the best all-around player. I mean, at his peak, okay, we can make the argument that Richard Sherman was the best Seahawks defender, but who was consistently there? Who was the one guy you could point to and say, well, on defense, he's the one that's preventing the 49ers from winning these games? It's Bobby Wagner. Interestingly enough, when he went to the Rams, though, he had a quiet year. That's how powerful the 49ers ownership of the Rams is, that even Bobby Wagner couldn't do anything in a Rams uniform against the 49ers. 2 very quiet games as a Ram. But he's got my respect. He's had a heck of a career. He's a Hall of Famer. And I have to admit, I'm a little worried I'm a little concerned that now he's back in Seattle again, even though he's a 33-year-old middle linebacker. I don't want to see him back in a Seahawks uniform, and he is. Number 2. Well, we just talked about the quarterback of the defense of the Seahawks. Well, number 2 is the actual quarterback of the Seahawks, the head of their offense, the leader of their team, Russell Wilson. And Russell Wilson was so bad because it was twice a year. And of course, in 2013, it was 3 times. He only lost to the 49ers 4 times in 10 seasons, including the one playoff game as a Seahawk. He had a record of 17-4 against the 49ers. You want to talk about ownership? And I can't even remember him having a bad game. He had average games, he had so-so games, but could he just have a bad game once? Never against the 49ers. Could he have an off day? No. Wouldn't happen, didn't happen. Couldn't happen. Russell Wilson and his Houdini act, I mean, it was like Fran Tarkenton. He was the modern Fran Tarkenton. It's not really a matter of, these long runs where he would gash you. It's not that he's Michael Vick or Lamar Jackson, or even what Colin Kaepernick would do. It was extending plays, and they could not get to him. It didn't matter if it was. And, you think about those 49er defense. How many great players did the 49ers have on those Harbaugh defenses? Patrick Willis, Navarro Bowman, Justin Smith. Say whatever you want about Aldon Smith. When the guy had his head in the game and he was out there, he was great. Ahmad Brooks. And we could go on. 49ers had great defense, and Russell Wilson was what stood in our way, and he really was magic against the 49ers. It was the extending plays, it was the deep throws, and he was one of those guys that I was always afraid of. And you saw him at the beginning of his career, you saw how focused he was, and you knew, okay, this guy is serious, and we're going to have to deal with him for a very long time. I mean, his ownership of the 49ers is so deep that, I can just rattle off the couple of wins the 49ers ever had against him. His rookie season, his first start against the 49ers, was a loss. He was a rookie. It was the start of his career. Then it was in 2013, the home game at the end of the season at Candlestick. They were able to beat the Seahawks. Then it was in 18, a victory the 49ers pulled out here. And then finally in 19, the Week 18 game up in Seattle, where the 49ers held on by, yes, a thread, the green law, stop at the goal line, which easily could have been a loss. We can talk about last year's game too, because it's not just the Seahawks' ownership with Russell Wilson over the 49ers. As a Bronco, he didn't even have a good game. It was a Sunday night game, the start of the season last year in 22. He didn't play particularly well. He just had one possession where he drove him down the field. They got a touchdown, and the Broncos were a terrible team. The 49ers could have easily gotten the Super Bowl. They should have gotten the Super Bowl. They got in the championship game. The Broncos were lousy all year, and he still managed to beat the 49ers. That's ownership for you. And what a highlight reel he would have if I pulled that up. Russell Wilson against the 49ers. As dominant as Russell Wilson was against the 49ers, number one is none other than Brett Favre. Brett Favre still gives me nightmares as a 49er fan. Brett Favre's a gunslinger. Brett Favre was one of a kind. He took chances. Yet, his ownership of the 49ers, as far as I'm concerned, is like there was no one else. There is no comparison to Brett Favre's ownership of the 49ers. The first 49er playoff game I can ever really remember watching that I was old enough that I could really understand something about the game was the 95 divisional playoff game in San Francisco, and what an upset it was. The 49ers should have at least been in the championship game against the Cowboys that season. But it was Brett Favre coming into San Francisco and his Packers. And it wasn't just Brett Favre. You can never point to only one player. But if you had to say, well, what was the reason for the Packers 49ers playoff games and all the disasters and the ownership of the Packers or the 49ers, you could say Holmgren was a part of it. Certainly. No one knew Steve Young better. But it's Brett Favre. Brett Favre. Just like Russell Wilson, I can't remember Brett Favre in a Packers uniform having a bad game. He'd throw his picks, because that was Brett Favre. But he would make the big plays, and what stays with you was not just certain plays. Like, I remember the game in Green Bay, the regular season game, where he hooks up with Antonio Freeman right at the start of the game, touchdown. This was not only a regular season ownership, it was playoffs. And yes, the Seahawks, as a 49er fan, you got to hate the Seahawks. But the Packers ended the 49er season. Brett Favre ended the 49er season, and that's what stays with you. That's what burns into your mind is those losses. 95. Yes, talk about bad timing. I was just a little too young to appreciate that 94 or even understand that 94 Super Bowl. But 95, losing to the Packers like the 49ers did. And then the next year in Green Bay, the mud game in Green Bay. The 49ers were wearing the white on whites because of the rain and the mud. They practically had brown uniforms. It was an ugly game, but of course the Packers won, and they'd go on to win the Super Bowl that year. And Brett Favre was doing Brett Favre things. Then you figure, well, things are going to change in 97 because the 49ers are hosting the NFC Championship game at home, and they got a new head coach. That was what was so bad about the 96 divisional playoff loss. That was George Seifert's last game. He had 5 rings with the 49ers, 3 as a coordinator or assistant head coach, and then 2 as the head coach. You have a new head coach. You're at home this time against the Packers because it was you want to talk about a nightmare. It was the 49ers in Green Bay. Don't even get me started on that. Was Steve Young never won in Green Bay. Jeff Garcia never won in Green Bay. The 49ers in 97 had the championship game. Here, new head coach, Steve Mariucci. They were flat. They just didn't show up. Brett Favre made the plays. Packers were back in the Super Bowl again. and it was crazy how many Hall of Fame players the 49ers had. Steve Young. I know Jerry Rice was out in that game. Steve Young, Terrell Owens. And on defense, let me give you a few of these names. Bryant Young, Kevin Green, Rod Woodson. Not to mention a bunch of other excellent players who had been in Pro Bowls. Didn't matter. And then there's the 98 playoff game. And I have to be honest with this, even though this is a channel where we're talking about a lot of 49ers football. I'm going to level with you. I'll be honest with you about the 98 playoff game in San Francisco. We know it is the catch-2 game where Steve Young connects with Owens. Owens. All due respect to Pat Summerall, the better call was Joe Starkey. On that, earlier in that drive, Jerry Rice did fumble, and the Packers should have won that game. It was a very short play. The Packers had half a field to stop the 49ers from winning the game. They didn't, and we can argue about it all day long, 49ers and Packers fans, and I'll be honest about it, that the 49ers should have lost that day. And it should have been 4 straight losses. But we'll take whatever we can get against the Packers. But it was 3 years in a row, and it easily could have been 4 years in a row that the 49ers season would have ended to a Packers loss. And that wasn't enough. 2001, the 49ers, after being down and Steve Young's career being over, forced into retirement due to that career-ending concussion, and that's back when they didn't protect quarterbacks. Same thing happened with Troy Aikman. Career-ending concussion even happened on his home field. Jeff Garcia is now the quarterback. Terrell Owens is a star, arguably the first or second best receiver in the NFL. The 49ers are back in the playoffs. And guess who they're going to play? The Packers. And it has to be in Green Bay. 2001 wild card. And what happens? They lose. Of course they lose. The Packers win, and that's just one more. So that's 4 out of 5 playoff games that Brett Favre beat the 49ers in. And again, it could have easily been 5 out of 5. As bad as those regular season losses were to the Seahawks, you had the regular season losses, which were plenty, and then you had the postseason losses at the hands of Brett Favre and the Packers. And what did it finally take for the 49ers to beat Brett Favre in the regular season? Yeah, that lost year in 2008 where he went to the Jets. I mean, can you even count that? I mean, again, I would take it, but I even said to myself, it's not the same. We beat Brett Favre, but he's not with the Packers. This Jet team is just, let's face it, they're not that good of a team. But that wasn't it. There was one more game that Brett Favre would face the 49ers, and that was in 2009. And he's a Viking back in the NFC. And the 49ers are starting to get at least a little better. But they're in the road, Minnesota, Metrodome. And Brett Favre didn't have a great game. I mean, he threw, again, his interceptions. He should have been picked maybe even more times than he was. Because there the Vikings were at the end of the game. And Brett Favre throws... He evades the pass rush. He buys time. And he throws a perfect dart into the end zone. A 30-yard touchdown. Only where his receiver could get it. Gets both feet down. And with time nearly expiring, only a few seconds left on the clock, the Vikings go ahead and they win that game. Just another Brett Favre miracle. And he didn't even have plays like that against the 49ers as a Packer. But he pulls out this one miracle out of his hat against the 49ers. And you call Russell Wilson magic against the 49ers. Well, Brett Favre was just on another level with that victory. Because, Russell Wilson didn't do anything astonishing or miraculous in that Broncos win. Brett Favre did it with the Vikings, and you look at his record. So Russell Wilson 18-4 against the 49ers, but Brett Favre 12-2, could be 13-1 with that 98 playoff game. 12-2. He was 8-1 in the regular season. Make that 7-0 as a Packer in the regular season against the 49ers, and he was 4-1 in the playoffs. There'll never be another Brett Favre against the 49ers. At least I sure hope there'll never be anyone like that. Russell Wilson was bad enough. But Brett Favre, he is the number one 49er destroyer.